as humans, we live in our minds. Well, that seems like an obvious thing. The difficulty is that though we live in our minds, we don't take command of our minds at a level that would enable us to function at the highest level of understanding and experience, would enable us to become self-fulfilled persons, would enable us to see through ideologies that have been inflicted upon us, that would enable us to see through our own egocentric nonsense. And so there's a sense in which we live in our minds and that we're trapped in our minds. And no matter how good any one of us is at thinking, we're always going to be limited because we can never fully enter another person's point of view. We can never fully understand another person, though we may think that we do. And we basically go around with the idea that everything that's happening in my mind is fine. There's nothing wrong with it. I don't need to change anything there. If I did need to change anything there, I would have already changed what was wrong. So I'm walking around typically thinking everything's fine that's going on in my mind. And I'm not recognizing that there are many flaws in my thinking. There are flaws in my assumptions, that I'm not always thinking logically, that I'm frequently not applying the tools of critical thinking, because there isn't a critical thinker per se. There are people who think critically to some degree, all of us to some degree, some of us at higher levels and more frequently, but all of us fail in critical thinking because none of us is perfect. And a big part of this is that we are trapped in our minds. We see the world from our own perspective. We don't see the world from anyone else's perspective. We don't experience firsthand someone else's pain, though we may try to sympathize with their situation. We don't ourselves feel what they're going through. So that is a barrier to our ability to empathize, to think within alternate points of view, which is an essential characteristic trait of the critical thinker. Humans are frequently irrational. We fight, we start wars, we kill, we're self-destructive, we're petty and vindictive, we act out when we don't get our way, we abuse our spouses, we neglect our children, we rationalize, project, and stereotype. And if you want proof that this is true, then all you need to do is read the newspaper and pay attention to the way that humans behave every day. And so we need to know why this is true. Most people who act in these ways would prefer not to, but they don't have command of their minds that would enable them to get past these destructive ways of thinking. So on the one hand, humans have a highly irrational side, and on the other hand, we have the capacity for great good, and we see that in the world in many ways. But we also recognize that people often act inconsistently, ignore relevant evidence, jump to conclusions, say and believe things that don't make any sense, and deceive ourselves in many ways. Think about the last time that you went to a meeting, let's say at your university, at your school, at your business, and ask yourself, to what degree did you have a clear purpose as a group? To what degree did you stick to your purpose? To what degree did you bring in relevant evidence? To what degree was your thinking bouncing around from here to there and not having any cohesive, let's say, path? So this is a common problem. People bringing in irrelevant information, being inconsistent, jumping to conclusions, and all kinds of other related problems. So at the same time that we're doing these things, we deceive ourselves into thinking that there's nothing wrong with our thinking. We may say that we can see problems in other people's thinking, but a major barrier to the cultivation of critical thinking worldwide is that people tend to think that critical thinking is good for your neighbor, it's good for your students, it's good for everyone except me, because I, the thinker, already know what is best. So in other words, most people think that they are the critical thinkers, and it's everyone else that needs critical thinking. And as long as we have that as a barrier, then we're not going to make much progress in critical thinking. Ultimately, many of us are our own worst enemy because we do not command the thinking that is commanding us. And as I've said, on the other hand, yet we're capable of developing as rational persons, of living an ethical life, contributing to the creation of a just and a critical world. But many people who are contributing to the advancement of human societies are also weak in thinking in some other parts of their lives. So they may be good at advancing animal rights and poor in their intimate relationships, or their parenting, or their ability to think like a good citizen more generally. So just because you're good at thinking in one area does not mean you're good at thinking in other domains of human life. And critical thinking enables us to think well across the important domains of our lives and to become fully rational persons to the degree that anyone can. So the way that I conceptualize the mind is that there are basically two overlapping and interrelated motivating impulses behind human irrationality. In other words, there are two umbrellas under which we can place irrational thinking. And of course, this is much more complex than thinking of this in terms of just two categories, but it's a good beginning place. So one category is the problem of egocentric thinking, which I'll be focusing on presently. Another problem, which is interrelated, is the problem of sociocentric thinking. And the two they function in a dynamic relationship with one another, but they can be considered separately and should be considered separately as well to understand them. So let's just get a sense of each of these concepts as a starting place. So we can consider human egocentricity as the natural human tendency to view everything within the world in relationship to oneself, or to be self-centered. And that comes from Webster's New World Dictionary. Now I'm going to be unpacking this as we move forward. But it's important to see that this is coming from educated usage, and the idea is when I'm thinking egocentrically, I'm seeing the world in terms of how it can serve me. And I'm thinking of it in terms of how I can get more of what I want. And that is my primary goal. Human sociocentrism can be most simply conceptualized as group egocentricity. So we can take the definition that we just looked at for egocentricity, substituting group for self, and here's what we get. Sociocentric thinking is the natural human tendency to view everything within the world in relationship to one's group, or to be group-centered. So you can see the parallels right away between these two phenomena. Now this is just basically saying in part what I've already said and going a bit further. So the human mind is frequently irrational while having the capacity for rational thought. And all of us exist on a continuum in terms of our egocentric and our sociocentric nature and our rational developed nature. Some people are just simply more rational than other people, or they may be, again, more rational in certain areas and irrational in other areas. And some people are just highly egocentric. My way or the highway is their view. Some people are highly sociocentric. They can't function without being continually validated by other people. And so it's complicated, but we have these forces working against one another. Egocentric and sociocentric thinking, sometimes working together, sometimes working against each other. But in any case, they're both working against the development of the rational mind or rationality. And so we naturally develop some intellectual skills as we are growing and we are developing, and we meet with certain people along the way, and some of those people are highly rational, and maybe we emulate some of their behavior. Some people are better at that than others. But if we're going to develop at the highest level, this is going to require, and you see on the right, the box on the right, it's going to require the active cultivation of intellectual traits, ethical sensitivities, and many intellectual skills. So we're naturally egocentric and sociocentric to varying degrees and based on cultural conditioning, and often those two things are very difficult to tease apart. We naturally develop some intellectual skills, of course, as we develop. But if we're going to function at the highest levels, and if we're going to create critical societies across the world, this will require active and explicit cultivation of ethical traits, intellectual virtues, and many intellectual skills that don't develop on their own.